Welcome everybody in person and watching later to our webinar on Where Can My Child Go to School? School placements for children with additional support needs. We're delighted that so many of you are joining us on this wet and windy autumn night. So my name is Hannah and I'm a Senior Advice and Information Officer here at Inquire, and I've worked at Inquire and on our helpline for over 7 years now. Before that, I worked in education policy at the Scottish Government. Before that, I worked with young people with learning difficulties. And before that, I was a young person who needed lots of additional support at school because I spent most of my education in hospital. And I'm here with my colleague, Mark, who I'll let quickly introduce himself.
Hiya, so I'm Mark. I've been at Inquire for over 4 years, so not quite as long as Hannah, but still plenty long. Before joining Inquire, I worked for Citizens Advice Scotland in various roles, including representing folk at the Edinburgh Sheriff Court. And I also worked for a mentoring charity for young folk in high school that were struggling to engage with their learning. I also, when I was in primary school myself, spent a bit of time learning out with school due to health stuff, and then returned to school in a wheelchair for a period before there were such things as ramps in school. So that was an interesting experience. But yeah, so delighted that everyone's here and looking forward to having a chat today.
Great, thanks, Mark. We also have our colleague Kat on the chat who will be putting any links for those of us who join live as we mention resources or links. I'm going to start with a really brief introduction to Inquire, then I'll cover a bit about the plan for this evening, and then we'll get really into school placements and where your child can go to school. So firstly, hopefully some of you have heard about us, but before we go any further, I'll just briefly explain a little bit about Inquire. So we are the Scottish Advice Service for Additional Support for Learning and are funded by the Scottish Government to provide independent advice and information to children, young people, parents and carers like yourselves, professionals, about children's rights and the legislation and guidance related to additional support for learning. As this slide says, our vision is that all children in Scotland are supported, included and listened to throughout their education. We do this through our direct one-to-one helpline advice. This can be over the phone, via web chat, email, and there's lots more details about how to use that on our website and our opening times. We also have our website, which has just been redesigned, which Mark was very involved in and is fab. And this has a lot of information on the key questions that parents and professionals ask us through the helpline. It also has a kind of very comprehensive list of all our publications, which we're probably going to mention through here, and key topics. So you can generally find anything that you might be looking for that we mention through our publications and website. We also have our Parents Guide to Additional Support for Learning, which we will share a link to how to order one of those yourselves. We also have our advice and information website for children and young people called reach.scot. We are also part of a partnership called My Rights, My Say, which gives advice, support and advocacy to children aged 12 to 15 to help them use their rights to be involved in decisions about their education. And we also do a lot of work around raising awareness, like this session, outreach, and on our social media. This is all done with the aim of making sure yourselves as parents and carers feel more listened to and supported, feel confident to take action, understand the rights and responsibilities of your local authority, school, and you as parents, know what steps to take, and hopefully know where to find out more information and help. So like the last session, if you came along, we've changed our format a little. So we're going to kind of try to give less information up front because I know it can be a bit overwhelming, and we'll focus more on your questions. So we'll start with Mark giving an explanation of how school placement decisions are usually made, how you and your child can be involved in these decisions, what you can do how to make a placement request, and what you can do if you disagree with the school placement being recommended for your child. I'll then cover a few of our frequently asked questions to the helpline, which will cover what to do if you have a placement request refused, what to do if your child needs transition support, but you are waiting for a decision, or if you've been told that your child needs to try mainstream before going to a special school. We will then leave as much time as possible to answer your questions, although some might be covered already as we chat. And yeah, so that's a bit of the plan. We'll start off by asking if you do want to start thinking about questions now. You can start popping them in the chat. As I mentioned earlier, to respect everyone's privacy, if you could please not include people's name, your child's names, or your child's school's name, or teachers' names, just so that we can talk about them more generally and respect everyone's privacy. Also, if possible, if you could put your questions to the whole group chat rather than to Mark or I, because sometimes we don't see them if it's very busy on the chat. But yeah, if you want to start putting in questions now, but you'll also have lots of opportunities as we go on. So I'll now pass on to Mark.
Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. So I've got 4 slides that I'll go through. It's a lot of information, so I've tried to condense it down as much as I can and do the main headlines, and we'll go into a bit more detail, I'm sure, as we answer some of your questions. So first, in terms of how school placement decisions are not. So every mainstream school in Scotland has a catchment area that is fixed by the local authority that run the school. So children will typically go to the school based on which area they live in. As a parent, you can ask to enroll your child at their local school, and what's important to always keep in mind when talking about this is whatever school your child ends up going to, they have a right to get additional support if they need it. So their rights to get support to help them fully benefit from their learning, they aren't dependent on them being in a specific type of school or a particular place. They have a right to support whether they go to their local school or another school. There is something that you might have come across called the presumption of mainstream in Scotland. So that's a Scottish government policy, but it's also within the law, and it's about
Mark, I
to
you're
have an inclusive, says that local authorities need to, oh, sorry. I'm not sure where we heard up until.
Yeah, you're coming and going a wee bit, Mark. I don't know if you want me to take over for a little bit or what would be most helpful, or if you just slow down talking maybe, and we can see how it goes. Okay, I think you're still breaking up a bit, Mark, so
Sorry, I think my internet connection's maybe not the best, Hannah.
No worries, that's fine.
You've frozen a bit for me as well.
Okay, I think I'll make a start. I think mine's still clear unless anyone's commenting saying there's any problems. So I think Mark had just got up to the presumption of mainstreaming, I think, and was talking about that this is a policy for inclusion. So it's something you might have heard about already, which means that local authorities must meet most children's needs within the mainstream setting. So this means that most children with additional support needs will still go to their local mainstream school, and should get the support they need there. And when it comes to kind of moving between schools, most decisions are made the year before a child's move. So that might be your child's last year of nursery, or it might be the P7 as they're heading towards moving up to high school. It can happen at other times, so mostly those decisions are made in that run up. But if your child is struggling at their between years or during the school year, decisions can still be made to change a child's school throughout the school year. For the decisions that are coming in, sorry, I'm thrown off by Mark being here, but I think he's going to try and talk through the next slide. So I was just reading that. So do you want to chip in?
No,
thrown off.
Apologies, Hannah. if you can hear me clearly, I'm happy to try and carry on, but please do let me know if I start breaking up again. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think what Hannah had covered there is in terms of timescales, it's generally that decisions will be made in a year before your child is due to move school or start a new school. But there are some situations where it can happen partway through the year. For example, if everyone sort of agrees that mainstream school that a child's in isn't meeting their needs and isn't suitable for them, it's possible to arrange for them to move partway through the year. But generally, for most decisions, it will tend to happen ahead of the new school year at the end of the summer holidays. So most local authorities will be starting to make their initial decisions around which children are getting places at which schools around December or January, which is why we wanted to do the event tonight, to make sure that you'll have a chance to start to think about this if it isn't already on your radar. There are some situations when an alternative placement can be considered. So, of course, there are different types of schools. So there's support units and bases that are within mainstream schools, and there's also special schools. Normally, that will be when mainstream is seen as not being suitable for the ability or aptitude of a particular child. If kind of professionals think that they can't provide the support your child needs to fully benefit from their learning, then they can apply to a group of people within the local authority that often are called the kind of school placement panel, or they go by slightly different names in different local authorities, but it's a kind of group of people within the local authority that consider all these applications together and decide which kind of pupils get offered places at which schools. It's possible that they'll accept if your child, let's say their nursery, puts in an application to the panel to ask for your child to be offered a special place at a primary school. There's kind of two things the panel can decide, really. They can say, yep, we agree, and here's a special school that we're going to offer them. Or they might say, actually, we feel with supports in place, your child can go to their local mainstream school. So that's the kind of two decisions they could make. Hannah, I'm not sure if it's right to go to the next slide. Maybe a good chance to check in if you can hear me.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you fine. So yeah, you can continue on, Mark. And I'm just seeing all your questions come in. So I'm taking notes of that for everyone, by the way, to see what we can answer. There's quite a few coming in.
Thanks so much for confirming that. It feels odd not having my camera on. So in terms of how you and your child can be involved in these decisions, it's really important that you are children first. So children have a fundamental human right to express their views freely in all matters affecting them. So that, of course, includes their education and where they go to school. That isn't just a kind of international human right, it's also been embedded into Scottish law, into our education and our support for learning laws. So your local authority must have due regard, the phrase is in the law, but they must have regard to your children's views in any significant decisions affecting them. They also need to take account of their views when they're reviewing what additional support they need with their learning. So again, both of those things would include which school they need to be in to get the support that they need. Parents and carers similarly have a right to have their views listened to and to be involved in decisions about their child's education and support. Kind of in practice, what this would normally mean is the people currently working with your child think they might need to go to an alternative placement, then what they would normally do is arrange a planning meeting to discuss that with you and your child, look at what options there might be, and that's normally when they would take account of you and your child's views. And if they're putting in an application, if it's decided that they are going to apply to the panel of people at the council to ask for an alternative placement, then there should always be a section on that form to reflect what your views are and what your child's views are. To help you make sure that you can share your views, there are a range of advocacy and support services that are available. You can have a look at our website and search for local services in your area. It's sometimes useful to go to your local carers centre. They'll often be aware of local support services. And there's also some national organisations like Salvation Mindroom, for example, that can support families with kind of helping them put their views across in meetings, like talking about their child's school place. Our website's got lots of tips in terms of working with the school and helping put your views across. And specifically for children and young folk, there's an advocacy service that we are a part of called My Rights, My Say. Part of that service is advocacy for 12 to 15-year-olds who have additional support needs. So that part of the service is run by Partners in Advocacy, and I'm sure if Kat hasn't already, our colleague will pop their contact details into the chat so that you know where to find them if that's something you think might help your child be involved in decisions. Hannah, is it right to go on to the next slide, please?
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. So, yep, in terms of, obviously, in an ideal world, everyone agrees on where your child should go, but that isn't always going to be the case. And sometimes you might disagree with either the place your child currently is being or where it's being suggested for them to go. So there are lots of potential routes out of that disagreement and different options for you to potentially take. The first is potentially to ask to review the support that's being offered and see if you can try and agree a way forward to improve things that doesn't require your child to move or to go to a different school. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a bit more detail when we answer your questions, but sometimes it can be helpful to set up a meeting with the proposed school and put your concerns in writing to them in advance of that meeting, and then it's sometimes a bit of a chance to see if they can come up with some answers and put a plan in place that you feel address your concerns and that you might be happy with moving forward. There are also sometimes others that can become involved to help you try and agree which school your child should be in. So that might be like involving your local authority representative, someone from the education department there, or maybe even someone from like a mediation service to try and help you agree a way forward if everyone's kind of gotten a bit stuck. And one of the final options, which I'll now come on to talk about in the next slide a bit more, is you always have the right to make a placement. So Hannah, if you wouldn't mind, onto the final slide, and then we can move on to some questions. Fab, thanks so much. So, as I said, one of the final options, if your child's be going to a different school than where they're being offered, is to make a placing request. A placing request is a formal recordable request that you make to a local authority, and it's when you ask for your child to be offered a place at a school that isn't their catchment school or the school that's being recommended by the local authority. You can make a placing request just to another mainstream school or to a special school. You can also make a placing request to an individual support unit or base within a mainstream school, or indeed to an independent special school. So you can kind of make one to a variety of different places that you might rather your child goes. But what is important in terms of how to make one is you have to name a specific school. So it's a little bit different to the process I talked about earlier, where your child's current school or nursery might apply just generally for some specialist provision without naming a specific place. If you're making a placing request, you have to make a request for your child to get a place at a named school, so somewhere specific you want them to go. Most local authorities have a form that you'd be able to normally find on site if you want to make a placing request, but it doesn't necessarily have to be through their form. It just has to be in writing or in a recordable format. And if you have a look at our fact sheet that's on school placements, we explain in a bit more detail the specific information you need to make sure to include if you want it to be legally treated as a placing request. The timescales for making one slightly depend when you're applying. So if you're say midway through the school year and you think things aren't working out and you want your child to move as soon as possible to a new school, then you can put in your request at any time and just make clear that you're applying to try and get a place as soon as possible. And the local authority would have 2 months to give you a response. If, however, you're putting a placing request in for the start of the new school year, so after the summer holidays, then the legal deadline to make sure you get an answer in time is the 15th of March. If you put in your application by then, the 15th of March, then the local authority will give you an answer by the end of April, by the 30th of April. If they haven't given you a response by one of those deadlines, then you can basically treat it as if they've said no. One of the things, there's a few possible downsides that I just wanted to mention briefly about putting in a placing request, and it's something I'm sure we'll cover in a bit more detail too through your questions. But one of them is, if you're putting in a placing request, that can mean that there's more of a delay before you'll have confirmed which school your child's going to go to. That can make things a bit trickier to plan for kind of what support they're going to need to kind of get settled into their new school and things if you're not yet sure which school they're going to be going to. Another possible downside is sometimes it can cause a disagreement with the local authority about transport, arranging transport costs. So we hear on the helpline that some local authorities often try to argue, if you've put in a placing request, even if they've accepted it, that you should have to pay for the transport because you've chosen to send your child there. That you can argue against that and sort of say that you feel that your child, you've applied to that special school, for example, because it was necessary and things, and you can sometimes argue around it, but it's just to say, like, if you're making a placing request, it's something you might need to be prepared for, that it won't automatically mean you'll get help with transport. And finally is, putting in a place request doesn't obviously guarantee that you get a place at the school you're hoping for. The local authority may say no, and if they do, you have a legal right to appeal the decision. Where that goes to slightly depends on what school or what type of school you've applied for. But we can go into that in more detail if people have got some questions about that. Hopefully my internet held up well enough there and everyone's heard that, but I think that was everything that I was going to cover initially, Hannah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mark. And I've been taking notes. There's been quite a few questions coming in, some which I'm going to cover in my section. There was a wee one I just wanted to follow up because it was very related to the school placing request. And I just thought I would cover it now, which was a parent saying, are placing requests done with the help of your current nursery, or would I do this myself, even though a generic placing request has been made by the nursery? So it's quite important to be aware of, kind of, as Mark's covered, there's the general way that school placements are being decided. So if your nursery is saying, we think your child might need to go to this school, we're going to pop that to the panel or the local authority a decision. They're called a bit of different things. That's a kind of internal decision that's being made. The difference between that is that's the local authority looking at where it's going to meet your child's school. A parental placing request, or just really officially a placing request, is where you put in your own request. So you can do that as well as the nursery's placing request, the nursery's request for your child to be considered for a different school. But the issue is, if you put in the parental placing request, the plus, as Mark mentioned, is that you'd have a right of appeal. But the downside is that you might have to pay transport. So I think it's worth kind of clarifying, is it a specific school, and is that the one the school are recommending for the nursery are recommending for your child that you feel is the most important thing, and just clarifying with them a bit more the likelihood that that's going to be the placement your child gets, or is it more just generally some sort of specialist placement? I hope that helps with that specific question. Before I go on a bit to the kind of pre-prepared questions we have, which I will also run through some of your questions that have come up already, if I can, as part of that. So I think we've already had a few questions come up around this already in the chat, but one of the common things we hear about is what, you know, your placing request has been refused. What do you do? And, you know, firstly, I think it's just worth acknowledging it's, you know, if you've got all that information ready and prepared and start talking to your child about that, I know it's a really difficult and frustrating situation to find out your placing request has been refused. Now, firstly, which I think someone had asked about when you receive the decision. So as I think Mark already mentioned, but firstly, you should receive, if you put in placing request by the 15th of March for the next school year, you have to receive response by the 30th of April. Any other time of the year, the local authority has to get back to you within 2 months. If they don't get back to you within 2 months, then it's a deemed refusal. So you that basically means that they're saying no, even though they haven't officially, and that then kind of kicks in your right of appeal. Now, ideally, when you got that refusal, you should have got a letter which sets out the reason why your placing request was refused. And there's certain grounds that it can be refused on, which you can read more about in our which are all covered in our school placement fact sheet. And as part of that letter, it should have told you where you could appeal to. So where you can appeal a placing request to will depend on what type of school you've requested for your child and a little bit about their circumstances. So for mainstream places, it's usually placements, it's normally the Education Appeals Committee, and that's kind of internally with the council, or there's the Additional Support Needs Tribunal for Scotland, which is if you make a request to a specialist school, a specialist base or unit, or in some circumstances if your child has a coordinated support plan or is waiting for one. Our pages 10 and 11 in our school placement fact sheet go through the grounds for refusal for you, and we have fact sheets on the tribunal and on the Education Appeals Committee that explain exactly the process and what you need to include in your appeal. And as Mark mentioned, the Additional Support Needs, if you're going to this tribunal, then there is a legal advice service called Let's Talk ASN. Even if you're making an appeal, and as we kind of already briefly touched upon, there's things that we always suggest that you consider, whether you're going to make an appeal or if you decide that you're actually going to accept the refusal and look at the decisions, look at the offer that's for the school that's been offered by your local authority. So whatever circumstance, if you're going to appeal or not, we always suggest you speak to the school that your child has been allocated and ask them, you know, how would they meet your child's needs? You and your child to go and visit this school. On one hand, this is helpful because it might reassure you. It also gives you information if you do feel the need to appeal about kind of what it is your concerns are, and allows you to think a bit more about what is about the school that you're maybe thinking of that this school can or can't offer. In contrast, you can also, if you're still unhappy or still worried after speaking to the school they're offering, to speak to your local authority Additional Support for Learning contact. And again, basically ask them, how do they feel the school they're offering can meet your child's individual needs? Because as Mark mentioned, the duty is to meet your child's individual needs. So the question of how they're going to do that can be a really helpful start in that conversation. And finally, you can take one of the further steps Mark briefly mentioned. So I'm covered in the section on our website on resolving disagreements. So often we suggest things like mediation to families disagreeing with the local authority about a school placement. So that's where someone independent of your local authority facilitates meetings between home and school or the council, which are really focused on your child and a way forward. And I suppose the main thing with this is that in this situation, although I know it's really difficult when you don't get the answer you're looking for, even if you decide to make that appeal, it's important to remember, and I suppose be prepared, you might not get the outcome you're hoping for from even the appeal. So it's worth working with and keeping some sort of an open conversation with the school and local authority in the meantime. I'm just checking my notes to see if there is anything else that I can cover in the questions. It's probably worth noting around making placing requests, you can make a placing request to any school. So if you stay in one local authority and you want your child to go to school in a different local authority, that's something that you can do. You can also make a placing request to different types of schools in Scotland. And I know there was a specific question we can maybe cover around, in certain circumstances, what you need to do to make a placing request. But generally, you have a right to make a placing request to any school in Scotland, and sometimes further afield as well. Is there anything you want to add before I go on, Mark? Or
yeah, just that I think you briefly touched on the question there, but I think it's a fairly quick answer. So I think the one you're referring to is we got asked if you're wanting to make a placing request to a local authority ran special school, whether or not you need to get the school's permission first. So legally, you don't need to necessarily kind of get permission or confirm from the school before you apply. If it's a local authority ran one, it can be a good idea to speak to the school first, because it might be actually they can give you information about whether they feel they're the right or the best place for your child. So we would normally recommend you do speak to them first. But there's only one sort of specific situation when you need to get the school's permission before you can make a placing request, and that's if you're applying making a placing request for an independent special school, so one that isn't ran by the local authority but one that's a kind of a fee paying special school basically. So hopefully that answers that question, Hannah.
Fab, thank you. Yeah, I noticed it but not fully read it. So the next one, the next subject we just wanted to cover, and I think it has been touched on in a few families when questions where people are waiting for the decision about transition, about their child's school placement. You know, as as we acknowledged before, you know, you can make a placing request at any time, but the decision for the next year, the kind of deadline that the local authority has to get back to you is the 30th of April. And obviously that can be quite difficult if your child is, you know, for many children, because there is also what we call a right to transition planning. So what that means is that the law says that your local authority needs to start, usually through the school, needs to start planning for your child's transition at least 12 months in advance of their move, if they're aware that they're going to move. The law doesn't say exactly what transition planning looks like, so it doesn't say they have to have decided for a school within that circumstances, but they need to start talking about and planning transitions. And as Mark mentioned, you should be part of that conversation. So if you do feel so that waiting, you know, you've put in a placing request and that's kind of holding up the process, or you're a bit worried about that process, then what the first thing to do is to ask for a transition planning meeting. Hopefully you've already had one if there's kind of 12 months in advance, but that can be the helpful part to acknowledge any concerns about the waiting time over the transition plan. So and also talking about if there are some adjustments that can be done. So for example, we sometimes hear of schools that have allowed for there to be kind of dual transition planning, so conversations with two different schools that are being offered, possibly, or visits to two different schools, and also just working out, is it more like the concept of moving that could be talked about with the school and your young person to prepare for that transition, or if you feel, so there's lots of things, that accommodations that can be made, and this is quite a common situation for that. It might not be clear exactly what school a child is going to before within this like 12 months period. So, you know, there might be things that your school and the possible schools they're moving to can do about that. However, if you do feel that your child may be significantly disadvantaged by that wait, and they really need transition planning in advance because of their support need, if they might be considered disabled, you might be able to ask for the decision on the placing request to be brought forward as a reasonable adjustment under equality law. There's more information on our fact sheet for disabled pupils and the law, which explains more about definition of a disabled child and more about what you can do if you think that might be something that you want to request. There's a particular advice service called the Equality Advisory and Support Service who can talk you through that in more detail, and you can obviously also give our helpline a call. Was there anything on that, Mark, you'd seen come up before I move on to the next question?
I don't think so. I think maybe we'll move on to the next, and I do have some other questions, but I think they're a little bit separate to that one.
Fantastic. Finally, and this I think was maybe being touched on, but I'll maybe just cover this one quickly, and then we can go a bit more detail into the questions. Another question we sometimes hear from families is that they are told their child needs to try mainstream before specialist provision will be considered. I know this can be quite a difficult conversation to be having. It's firstly important, as Mark I think already mentioned earlier, to remember that wherever your child goes to school, they have a right to adequate and efficient support. The type of school does not impact this right. So I know there's a few questions that had been asked that I noticed around my child's struggling now and I put in a placing request, what support can be provided while I'm waiting, or just some general questions around maybe children that you don't feel need moved, your child you don't feel needs moved but is struggling. It's really important to remember that whatever school your child is in, they are entitled to support, and there's conversations you can be having, and a lot of information on our website around, and obviously you can speak to us as well about what support they're getting at the moment and reviewing the plans around that support. And the school and the local authority need to have an offer about where they feel can meet your child's needs and be able to talk you through that. As we mentioned, it's also expected that the local authority meets most children's needs in the mainstream, and there are lots of different types of support that can be provided there. However, as we also mentioned, there are exceptions to this presumption of mainstreaming, and that's where a mainstream school wouldn't suit your child's ability or aptitude. Educating your child in a mainstream school would negatively affect other people's learning, or the cost of educating your child in the mainstream would be unreasonably high. If you feel one of these applies to your child, the first step we usually recommend is speaking to your child's school and any proposed school, if they're about to move, about your child's individual needs, their understanding, and really clarifying down how do they feel they can meet your child's needs within the school that's being offered to them. And then there is, I put a wee link in there, there is, it's not for everyone because it's quite detailed guidance, there is also Scottish Government guidance for schools and local authorities on making this decision around presumption of mainstreaming, and it has some quite helpful, like what they call reflective questions schools should be considering when they're saying whether a child can stay in the mainstream or whether they need to go to a more specialist provision. It might be helpful to have a look at that, and you could even ask the school and the council some of these. Now, if you speak to the school and you're not reassured, you can speak to your local authority and also use all the routes that we've mentioned before to resolve disagreements. If you still can't agree about where is the best provision, and you could consider making a placing request as well. Right, Mark, does that sound okay? Can I pass back to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been quite a few questions coming in. I'm trying my best to kind of group a few of them together. So there was one around whether or not someone lived quite close to the border between two local authorities, and they were asking if they can apply to a school that's actually closer to them, but that's in a different local authority to the one that they live in. So the quick answer to that is yes, you can apply to schools that are in different local authorities. If you are doing that, you need to apply to the local authority that run the school. So if you, for example, live, let's say, in Midlothian, but you want your child to potentially go to a school that's run by the City of Edinburgh Council, you would put your placing request into the City of Edinburgh Council. That's also slightly linked to that in terms of the kind of schools that you can apply to. There was a question around whether support units and support bases within mainstream schools are given out on the basis of catchment area. So not in the same way that mainstream parts of the school would be. So if it's the mainstream part of the school most places at that school will be given out based on the pupils that live in the catchment area. It might be one of the things that is kind of taken into account when they're making the decision, but generally for support units and support bases, they're set up to help meet the needs of pupils that need extra support than can be ordinarily provided in the mainstream setting. And that means they can and often will sort of allow admit pupils that live out of catchment if that's seen as being one of the better kind of support settings for them that's across the local authority area. As I say, it might be that if they have a high demand and things, that they might give a bit more priority to a pupil that is in that area already, but it isn't the kind of your child could potentially go to a support unit or base that is in another school out with your catchment. So hopefully that answers those two. I can keep going. There's lots of other questions, Hannah. But
I was just seen a little one come in that I just thought I would answer right now, which was, can you make multiple placing requests? So I think someone was asking if they can make a request to their base in their child's school and also make a request to a special school. You can make multiple placing requests. However, you can only appeal to the Additional Support Needs Tribunal once every year. I think you can appeal multiple times. The Educational Appeals Committee, I'm not sure if I know that one off the top of my head. I don't know if you do, Mark, but you just have to be cautious about the number of placing requests. So you can make multiple placing requests. The issue is around how many you can appeal.
I think I might need to double check, and we could maybe include it in our follow-up email just for accuracy. But I think, Hannah, off the top of my head, you can make one appeal to the Education Appeals Committee for a placing request and one appeal to the tribunal per year, but you couldn't do multiple in one of those places within the same year, I think. But it's a bit of a specific one, so we can maybe include that in the follow-up.
Definitely.
So kind of related and talking of the tribunal, there was a question from someone that sort of unfortunately didn't get the outcome they were hoping for when they made a placing request, and they've tried mediation but still weren't able to agree things, so are now kind of waiting on things going to the tribunal, and they're saying they still didn't have any dates for that and asking how long it should take. So regardless of whether or not you've tried mediation and things, mediation doesn't pause the clock. You still have the 2-month deadline from when you receive the decision to put in the appeal to the Additional Support Needs Tribunal if it was a placing request to a special school that you or a support unit or base. In terms of once you've put that in, it can take a number of months. It kind of depends on a few different factors, how busy the tribunal is. But one place that I'm not sure if we've mentioned yet is Let's Talk ASN is a service that supports families across the whole of Scotland who have a right to go to the tribunal. They offer kind of pre-legal advice and support, and they can even represent people at the tribunal if things do go all the way to a kind of hearing on that. So what I would say is if you think you've put in a tribunal kind of appeal already, it's called making a reference. But if you've already put that into the tribunal and you are not sure what's happening and you're not sure your timescales yet, the best place for you to get in touch with would be Let's Talk ASN, and that's a service that's run by Govan Law Centre and Bernardo Scotland.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful. I've just seen a few conversations going back and forwards about placing request deadlines, and a few parents being told that there's a deadline. I think it was in Glasgow for this Friday or soon. I think it was covered in Mark's, but I don't know if it was when his signal had gone a bit strange. So the legal deadline for putting in a placing request for your child to go to school in the next school year is the 15th of March. So 15th of March 2023, and you'd hear back by the 30th of April. However, quite a lot of local authorities have preferred sort of internal deadlines. So what they will ask is that there will be a request that ideally you get a placing request in if you want your child to go to that school in advance, and the reason they do that is because they will be making the earlier you get it in, the more you will be considered within the kind of whole picture of decisions around. So it doesn't mean that you can't put in a placing request. You can put that in for the next year up until the 15th of March, and you will have to get a response legally by the 30th of April. But you can, but if there is an internal deadline, we'd really encourage you to follow that, because what that will be is the local authority's internal process of collecting all those placing requests together and making the decision. So on one sense, there is a bit of it that you can put in a placing request after that. You can put in a placing request at any time of year, in fact, and they have to get back to you within 2 months. But it's quite it's beneficial if you can get it in that time period, because it gives your child the best chance to be considered, along with all the other placing requests that are coming in. I hope that makes sense. I've got a few other questions. Sorry, someone is just saying my child's in P7 now, needs to go to high school August 23. So the deadline, would be March 2023. But if you if you can get it in earlier, that is ideal in general. There was a few other wee questions I just wanted to cover, unless you wanted to add anything in on that one, Mark.
No, it was just I suppose to add on to that a little bit around the logic behind it is we've already explained and pointed out that we know it can be a tricky situation if things are done within the legal timescales, but if things are done you get the decision made not until the 30th of April, that leaves a lot less time to kind of then start that transition planning and how your child can be supported to go to the school that they're going to ultimately go to, especially if you then go through an appeal after that. So these earlier deadlines, although it can feel a bit like an added pressure, actually it's often for good reasons. It's to try and help these decisions be made earlier in the year, and to then allow for more time for discussions and to try and reach an agreement. And then once it's decided where your child's going to go, for you to then work together with that school to make sure they've got all the information they need and there's a plan in place to give them the help that they're going to need. So it was just a little bit more explanation behind that, but I totally agree with everything you said, Hannah.
Thanks. The other one I just saw, it was a wee while ago, but I just wanted to make sure I covered it because it was a bit of a quick answer. I know someone mentioned that they were moving, they just moved to Scotland, and that they were wondering about, they didn't really know where to begin with the school placing process. We have a section on our website which covers particularly families in this situation who are about thinking to or have just moved to Scotland, that explains a bit about the process. I know with that parent, and it might be just something to be aware of as well for families moving, just because the local authorities have a duty to take into account all the information you provide about your child's needs, whether that was they were being educated in a different country or in a different local authority, but they don't have a duty to provide the exact same support. So for example, just because your child was in as a unit or a specialist school in England or in France, doesn't mean that they will get the exact same support when they come to the UK. But that information should be taken into account, and it's great to pull together any information you do have and approach the school. But there is, I think I just saw Kat has popped in a wee link to that piece of info, that part of our guidance of our website. So that should hopefully help with that.
Yeah, there's quite a closely related question to that, Hannah, from someone else that is not yet in Scotland, but have said they're planning to move to Scotland, and kind of asking, can they get a bit ahead of the game? Can they start to try and decide where their child's going to go to school before they've actually moved? So the answer to that is a kind of partly. So you can certainly do a bit of research online, and it might be, if you know which area of Scotland, which local authority you're going to move to, it might be helpful to try and get in touch with the local authority's additional support for learning kind of contact. You can find those people on our website. You can search for them and their contact details. So ahead of moving, you can absolutely do research and get in touch with them and speak about what your child's needs are and when you're moving and where you're moving to, and try and start some of that planning, but legally the local authority won't become responsible for your child's education until they're living in Scotland. So it means some councils, some local authorities will be a little reluctant to go too much into planning until they know for certain that they're going to have to educate your child. So sometimes if you don't yet have an address, for example, it'll be a little bit harder to pin down the local authority to a specific school, but it's certainly no harm in doing a bit of research first, and then once you do move, hopefully that will allow things to move a little bit quicker. And the same website that Kat linked to for Hannah's earlier question about moving to Scotland is hopefully a good one for you to have a look at as well.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. I just noticed there was a question we hadn't dealt with where just someone was asking a bit more about what a support unit is, and will they tailor to your child's needs throughout their school journey. So yeah, there's lots of different types of education units and bases within different local authorities. What units, so all the local authorities look a little bit different in how they provide support. So you tend to have your mainstream schools and your special schools, and then there is also sometimes additional classes or units that are attached to mainstream schools, so that young people might either spend some of their time within the mainstream classes and also access a unit or a base to get the right to get sort of specialized support within that. They're all called a little bit of different things within different local authorities, so I'm afraid I can't say there's not a definition that says this is exactly what a support unit is, but they tend to be, it's not kind of a full school for children with additional support needs. It'll be something normally attached to a mainstream school in some way and allows young people access to some of the support in that unit, or it's sort of within the bigger school environment. Yeah, that parent also asked, do they tailor to a child's needs throughout their school journey? That's, I mean, a support unit will do that, but that's something that there is a duty to be identifying your child's individual needs, offering them support and keeping support under review wherever your child goes to school. So the whatever school journey your child is on, there should always be kind of planning involved in that support, and it should always be tailored to your child's individual needs. So it's not necessarily something that only support units do, but if your child was to attend one, then they should be offered that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm conscious of time, but hopefully we can still fit in a few more questions. There was one that came in asking again about the kind of types of schools that you can potentially apply for. So it had asked, the parent had asked if a local authority don't have any appropriate school that they can offer, if they're kind of coming up a bit short with a suitable school based on what your child's individual needs are, can they kind of can you ask them to basically pay for or find a different school somewhere else? The answer to that is local authorities will normally try and consider what support they can put in place first to help your child learn within a mainstream school. If they don't think that's possible, they'll look at their support units and bases and special schools. But if they still don't feel like they have anywhere that's suitable or where they can help your child benefit fully from their learning, then they should look at other options, which might include schools in neighbouring local authorities, or potentially paying for them to attend an independent special school. So that's generally the order that the local authority would kind of consider schools within, but you can make a placing request to any of those types of schools and any schools that are in a different area as well, if you know where you want your child to go and you feel you want to do that.
Great, thank you, Mark. I can see we've still got a few different few questions coming in. I know that there was someone kind of clarifying about if the local authority have already requested places for your child, will your place and request interfere with that? I suppose they shouldn't, in theory, you know, if you're still putting in the request, it's probably all going to go into the same bit of conversation. The issue is if you put in that placing request, the plus is that you get that right to appeal, but the minus is that you might have to you might have to pay transport costs. So it's a bit of a kind of, it might be a conversation that if that parent wants to talk about some more detail, and maybe some of the other questions I know kind of go into a bit more very specific situations, you are welcome to also give us a ring on our helpline or drop us an email. It's one of the things about kind of school placements is there's quite a lot of ifs and buts, and depending on what situation is going on for your child. So I don't know if there's any you saw that we could quickly answer, Mark, before we kind of start to wrap up.
Just one, I think I've covered it, but it's quite a quick one. So someone had asked how, I think we've said quite a few times that one of the options, if you're worried about where your child's being offered, is to get in touch with your local authorities to clarify how to do that, or where you can find that information. On our website, under resources tab at the top, there is a kind of local authority contact details section that you can click on. You can look for your local authority and it will give you any of the information that's been shared with us. So hopefully a number, but certainly normally an email address for one of the key contacts that parents can get in touch with about any additional support for learning concerns, including school placement decisions.
Great, thank you, Mark. I can see we haven't managed to answer every single question. I've noticed there's a few that come in are maybe not particularly specifically about school placement, so we haven't gone into a lot of detail around them. We do have previous webinars, so the ones that are up on our YouTube channel. So I noticed there was a question about if your child's out of school at the moment. We did in a webinar last month that was on when a child can't go to school and on school attendance. And I suppose in general, I think a few of the questions are around the support that's in place for your child at the moment, and if they're struggling. And we have quite a lot of information on that kind of covered in our other webinars. And I suppose the main thing around that is just because you're waiting for a new school placement or you've put in a placing request, it doesn't stop your child's right to support now. So those are always situations where kind of going back to the school, talking about planning, asking how they're going to meet your child's needs, how they can meet your child's needs, and raising concerns. Those conversations can still all be happening, even if your child is struggling at the moment. Yeah, I think I'm sorry we didn't manage to answer everyone's questions. We will. You can, get in touch with our helpline. There is also quite a lot of resources, lots of resources available on our website. I'll just click on to the next page because that should put that up. And you can also get an access to our parents guide. We'll send a follow-up email with a link to this webinar, and we will also share with you the key links and clarify that question I think we had earlier, and if there is anything else that we can cover, we'll put that in the website in the follow-up email. Finally, before we finish up, if you've got your phone to hand and you're tech savvy doing that, if you would be able to fill in our evaluation form, that's the QR code there, and you can also, Kat's going to pop a link to our evaluation forms as well. It really helps if you can let us know if this worked for you, and any feedback. We're always looking for ways to improve and get our information to parents, to yourselves, in ways that work for you. That's linked to order our parents guide, and you can also sign up to our newsletter. But from myself and Mark, even though we can't see him, thank you very much, and I really hope that was helpful. Okay.
Yeah, thanks everyone for bearing with me, and sorry for the internet problems.